architecture is ugly. They speak this weird fucking Punic language and they're far too close to Rome's borders. There is serious there and we need to destroy them. Also, Nero didn't kill himself. Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Drunk History with Graf. This is a series in which I drink some alcohol and talk about history, starting from the Bronze Age going all the way up to present day. Last episode we talked about the foundation myth of Rome and how they got to be the most dominant state on the Italian peninsula. And in this episode we will talk about Rome and its relationship with its soon-to-be iconic nemesis, the Punic colony of Carthage. Last episode, the Mediterranean looked like this. The Republic of Rome dominates the entire Italian peninsula, with the exception of Sicily. Greece is as it was before, and the majority of North Africa, starting from Tunisia, is controlled by the Punic city of Carthage. Now, I took an entire episode pretty much to talk about the foundation of Rome, but Carthage is much simpler. There's no massive mythology behind it, it's very simple. You see, while the Greeks were spreading out and putting colonies on the south of what's now France, and Italy, and Turkey, and all across the centre of the Black Sea, the Phoenicians were doing the same. They were settling all across the Mediterranean, creating colonies of their own. And by far and away the most powerful of these was Carthage. Just like the Greeks, the Phoenicians were not a single kingdom, they were a variety of squabbling city-states. The most prominent of which back in the Levant was a city called Tyre, which is infamous for, as I mentioned in the second episode, its purple dye called Tyrian dye, or Tyrian purple. Carthage was supposed to have been founded in sort of the 800-700s BC sort of time, but no one really knows for sure. And it was controlled for this time by its mother city of Tyre. However, when Tyre got conquered by the Achaemenid Empire, Carthage became independent, and with no oversight and their perfect positioning for all of the trade routes of the Mediterranean, they began to accumulate a lot of wealth and a lot of influence over the surrounding kingdoms. So, how come I was able to summarise the origins of Carthage so quickly, but it took me an entire episode to do Rome? Well, now is the perfect time to discuss writing and history. See, there's a common phrase that gets bandied around, and you've probably heard it. It goes like this: history is written by the victors. And what this phrase suggests is that whoever it is that comes out best out of history gets to decide what people think about the other side. And there's a grain of truth to this. There is a grain of truth to this. But what I think is a much more appropriate thing to say is that history is written by writers. And that seems like an obvious thing to say. Of course it's obvious. Until you realise the deeper implications of that. If you don't write, if you don't have writers, then you won't write history. That's why we understand history from the perspective of the Greeks and the Romans and not the Carthaginians or the Germans. Because we have access to the historical material that was written by the Romans and the Greeks, and we don't have a huge lot of surviving records from Carthage. This can be for a variety of reasons. It can be 1, they didn't write them, or 2, they're indecipherable, or 3, they were destroyed. So there are some civilizations that we don't know a whole lot about from their own perspective, specifically because the records were destroyed, and European imperialism in Africa and America tends to have this kind of effect in which they will destroy native writing, because history is written by the writers. We don't remember Rome and Greece because they succeeded and did well. We remember Rome and Greece because they wrote down everything they did. And maybe Carthage wrote down everything it did as well, but we don't have access to that because it evidently didn't survive. That's why I say that there is a grain of truth in the whole history is written by the victors, because sometimes the victors will go out of their way to destroy the writings of the vanquished. Now, from last episode, I talked about this epic poem called the Aeneid, which detailed the founding of Rome and its mythical origins in Troy. In this poem, Carthage is actually mentioned. There is a chapter in which Aeneas and his crew stop off in Carthage, and Aphrodite, being the shipper that she is, sets Aeneas up with Queen Dido of Carthage. This inevitably goes badly when Hermes insists that Aeneas has to continue on to find Italy. So, when Aeneas leaves, that leaves Queen Dido heartbroken, and she swears a curse that Carthage will forever be an enemy of Aeneas and his descendants. So why do I bring this up? Because the Aeneid was written centuries after this, as essentially a propaganda piece. This is meant to be a bit of foreshadowing. The people who wrote this knew what happened afterwards, and they included this as sort of a nod to knowing that Carthage was going to be an enemy of theirs. And there's also some interesting trivia about the name of Carthage, because the name Carthage is an anglicization of the Phoenician Carthage, meaning new city, which is extremely ironic when you realize that in their native tongues, Carthage and Naples have the same name. Rome and Carthage at this point were both empires. Rome did not refer to itself as an empire, but absolutely it was an empire. It was just a different kind of empire than what was normal. Now, Carthage was fairly conventional in its way of imperialism. They functioned as a tribute system much in the same way that the Achaemenid Empire had, in which they would bring their army up to a local kingdom, flex their wealth and show their power, and demand submission from the local king. And the reason that Carthage would do this was mostly to open up trade. Carthage was a trading empire more than all else. If you notice its position right there, this means that anyone wanting to go in and out of the Mediterranean or trying to go across it, Carthage is a great place to stop, no matter where you're going. So they can collect import taxes from all kinds of travellers going all over the place. And this made them very rich. And so the more trade that went around, the richer Carthage would become. This meant that when they went and made these native kingdoms submit, they could then use their manpower. Carthage was renowned for its use of mercenaries. And what it would do was it would put various kingdoms into its sphere of influence, not even entirely conquering them in the same way that the Persians would, even lighter touch than them, and would then shell out some money to hire that kingdom's army. This meant that the Carthaginian armies that faced off against Rome were from a variety of places. They contained a variety of peoples in them, such as Numidians, Balearics, Celtiberians, even Greeks, sometimes even various Italic peoples. Rome, on the other hand, functions in a very different way. Carthage is dependent on mercenaries, and it uses its vast wealth that it gets from taxing trade to finance that. Rome, on the other hand, having been traumatized from the Gauls, feels the need to be strong in and of itself. Carthage has very few actual Carthaginian soldiers, but Rome, the Roman army is made up of a core of wealthy Romans who bought and paid for their own armor and equipment and trained hard. Rome is absolutely a country of citizen soldiers. And both of these systems have their advantages and their disadvantages. The Carthaginians, the disadvantages of their system are going to become quite obvious fairly quickly. Rome, it's going to take a little longer. Probably a decent load of episodes. Right, now that we've established Rome and Carthage and kind of what they're like, let's talk about something completely different. When Rome had first come to predominance in Latium, they signed a treaty with the Carthaginians, dividing the world as they saw it up into spheres of influence. However, these spheres of influence were fairly vague. In the terminology of the day, this was basically Carthage would have free reign over Africa, and Rome would have full reign over Italy. However, if you look at the borders of Italy today, you'll notice some confusion, because Sicily, is that part of Italy? Or is it an island? Is it an island that's part of Italy? Well, back in the day when there was no single state to rule over the entire thing, these questions were a lot harder to answer. And so, Sicily was going to become a point of contention because Carthage really liked having these island bases. That meant that if anybody was going through the area and they didn't stop at Carthage, they would have to stop somewhere else. And they would probably end up stopping on one of these islands like Malta, or Sardinia, or Sicily. So that made islands like this especially valuable to Carthage. But Rome considered them to be part of Italy, which, of course, was given to them in this treaty. That made Sicily a powder keg waiting to explode in both of their faces. And explaining the spark that sets this off is going to take a little while. And to explain it, we're going to have to go back to our old friend Syracuse. Again. Causing trouble. Again. Well, it can hardly be considered Syracuse's fault in this case, as Carthage, as it was attempting to gain control of all of the coastline of Sicily to help its trading empire. And so, of course, war were declared between Carthage and Syracuse. Initially, the war went very well for the Carthaginians, who pushed on to Sicily and fought some battles, winning against the Syracusans. However, the Syracusan tyrant Agathocles scraped together an army and snuck out on a small fleet destined for Africa, where he went and attacked Carthage straight up. This initially went very well for the Greeks. However, the tide quickly turned when they failed to capture the city of Carthage itself, because guess what? Carthage also has walls, and siege technology is still fairly bad. The Syracusans and the Carthaginians eventually brought their fight back to Sicily, where after a few more battles, a treaty was concluded with status quo ante bellum. But this left a lot of dissatisfied people, especially in Syracuse, because the Syracusan tyrant, Agathocles, had hired a bunch of mercenaries himself, and these were Italians. And in the year 288 BC, when Agathocles kicks the bucket, they're suddenly unemployed. So, what do? Because they're now away from their home in Campania. Instead, they're in Sicily, far away from their homes and families, and without work. So, they instead go to the nearby city of Messana and take it over. And they use Messana as a base to go and raid the surrounding areas as pirates. And this is especially confounding given that Messana has been the goal of Syracuse for a while, and it was that ambition that had brought them really into conflict with the Carthaginians multiple times up until this point. But this group of Oscan pirates, who wound up calling themselves the Mamertines, meaning sons of Mars, pulled a trick on the natives of Messana and just took the whole thing over. Just like that. It was then that the Mamertines decided to do something extremely stupid, which would fuck them over completely, and everyone else. Because Syracuse, with their new tyrant, wanted Messana back under its influence, and so it began mustering an army to go and take it back. And so the Mamertines sent an envoy to Carthage for support, to defend them from the Syracusans, who they had previously been employed by fighting against the Carthaginians. That's smart. And the Carthaginians, for some fucking reason, accept. And they turn up at Messana with their garrison and their fleet, and they just kind of sit there and wait for the Syracusans. But the Mamertines eventually find out that the Syracusans are negotiating with the Carthaginians for control over the city. And so then they decide to do something even more stupid that would fuck over everyone even more. They sent a message to Rome asking for help to expel the Carthaginians. This would escalate very quickly, as the Roman Senate debated on whether or not to accept the request from the Mamertines. They are unable to come to a conclusion, so they put the vote to the people. The people vote to accept and to intervene on behalf of the Mamertines. I think there are a number of reasons why Rome decided to do this. I have heard several times people wondering why the fuck Rome would do this, but there are very good reasons why. One being that Sicily was, well, they considered it to be part of Italy, therefore given to them by the Carthaginians. Therefore, the Carthaginians' presence there would be breaking the treaty, as the Romans perceive it. Additionally, they're also very, very close, and the Carthaginian fleet could potentially fuck over trade in the area completely if they wanted to, which would severely hurt Rome's economy. And it would also hurt the economies of all of southern Italy, which Rome had taken under their control. And that couldn't do, because that would break Rome's relationship with these areas. You see, Rome was a new kind of empire. Unlike Carthage, which could do with symbolic boot kissing, Rome was an empire that's probably a lot more familiar to us because most empires that came after it attempted to imitate it, which is they attempted to impose their culture and their language and their way of life on the people they conquered. Failing that, they would settle Romans in the areas that they had conquered to help expedite this process. And so, damaging the economies of these areas of southern Italy would severely slow down or even stop the Latinization. So that's a few of the reasons why the Romans decided to go into this. So this is the start of the First Punic War, Rome, however, has a bit of a problem. You see, at the start of this, Rome doesn't have a navy of any kind. Due to the nature of their imperium, Carthage has built a massive navy because in order to police trade and to keep up their hegemony over the seas, Carthage needs a fleet. Rome has always stuck to Italy thus far and so has never needed a fleet. Any time that Romans needed ships, they would hire out Greeks to build them for them. Now, this was not acceptable and they needed the ships to be able to challenge the Carthaginians, but they didn't even know how to build ships. You see, complex tasks like this are passed down from father to son generationally within a civilization. A civilization only has as much knowledge as is passed down through the generations, and is specific to that civilization, which is why equipment from any one given culture looks fairly similar, but any other culture it looks different because that's the knowledge passed down within that culture. But there was no shipbuilding tradition within Italy. They had always contracted out to the Greeks. But the Romans really lucked out, because not too long ago there had been a storm in the Straits of Messina, which meant that there would be shipwrecks, and sure enough, there were a couple of Carthaginian ships that had washed up on the shores of Italy. And the Romans found these shipwrecks, pulled them apart and reverse engineered them, and found out how to build triremes in the style that the Carthaginians had. That meant that the Romans would now be able to build a navy and be able to challenge the Carthaginians. Granted though, this would take some time. Once this started though, the war would be fairly simple. The Romans and the Carthaginians every single year would throw an army into Sicily, and they would have a go at it, and then usually try to retreat. All the while, the navies of each country would try to destroy the navies of the other country to prevent them from picking up their army or deploying it in the first place. Now, what would normally happen at the beginning of this war would be if the Roman fleet was caught by the Carthaginians, they would be fucked. But if the Romans managed to slip past, then the Carthaginians would be fucked on land. As the war dragged on though, the Romans started to learn how to fight at sea, and they started to get the upper hand of the Carthaginians. This war dragged on for a total of 23 years, and left tens of thousands dead. But by the end of it, Rome had properly gotten the upper hand against Carthage. Both states were exhausted. In fact, there is a record of a message being sent from Carthage to Egypt asking for a 2,000 talent loan, which ends up actually getting rejected because it's too much. Rome, likewise, has expended a huge amount of its population doing this, with some estimates saying that Rome has spent up to 17% of its adult male population in this war. Eventually, the Carthaginians throw in the towel and sue for peace, leaving them 3,200 talents in debt to Rome as war indemnity, as well as evacuating Sicily and leaving it entirely to Rome. The long-term impacts of this war cannot be overstated, but much like the First World War, it gets ultimately overshadowed by the second one that came afterwards, as well as ultimately causing said sequel. And that is what we are going to be discussing in the next episode, because that is where we're going to be leaving off this episode today. Normally, I would give a quick word about what we're going to be looking at in the next episode, but because I've just done that, I think I'm just going to end it here. This has been Graf. I will see you all next time. Thank you very much.